Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1500 to 2000 Elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. Today we're up against the Sicilian Defense, and as with the previous video on the channel, I'm going to be playing the A3 Sicilian, known as the Mengarini. And in the last video, my opponent played knight to c6. You can check out that video if you want to see how we absolutely crushed that variation. And in this game, my opponent goes e6. And interestingly, both of these moves kind of accomplish the same goal of adding a second defender to the b4 square. Because a3, the only purpose of a3 on the surface is to push b4 with more support, right? So most black players will think, well, okay, well, I'll just stop that then. We're going to do it anyway. That's the entire point. The whole point is that we're going to do it anyway. And after the trade, like in the last game where the knight took on b4, if the bishop takes on b4, the plan is exactly the same. We push pawn to c3 with tempo on the bishop, and then we push d4 and take the entire center. Now, the only difference is that there's no knight on c6, and this pawn is on e6 rather than back on e7, which is different from the previous line. So we're going to push d4, but that is not a particularly big problem, because all e6 really does is support the move d5. And believe it or not, d5, if I remember correctly, is not a particularly good move, because we're going to push e5. We're not going to take, you can leave the tension. I think the computer likes moves like bishop d3 here. Personally, though, I think it's far more natural to push e5, and we get this exact same pawn structure as we got last video. And the main point is just to clamp down on the f6 square, which is very annoying when we play our next move. Try and find an aggressive move here for white that is very difficult for black to deal with. The move is queen to g4. Now, I believe this is the best move. But even if it's not, it's for sure the most aggressive move. And this g7 pawn, because we control the f6 square, is very, very weak. Because normally the knight would come to f6, for example. We would take, rook g8 would happen, and black would get excellent compensation for the pawn that he sacrificed. Alternatively, the reason that I didn't go queen g4 in this position is, one, knight to f6 exists, but more annoyingly, bishop f6 exists. And because we don't have the pawn on e5 to control the f6 square, we can't boot the bishop away, and the pawn is very well defended. But here, my opponent pushes g6. And if I am correct, I believe king to f8 is the best move. And also, by the way, in this position, bishop f8 is the best move, believe it or not, because queen g4 is such a big threat to go after the g7 pawn, right? And this is why I don't care about the inclusion of e6, because all it does is helps us achieve this pawn structure quickly, because e6 supports d5, of course, and then d6 can't be played, undermining the e5 pawn. So, okay, we're a pawn down, but we've got a very, very nice position. g6, of course, weakens a ton of the dark squares around the black king. But we don't have an immediate way in. So, there's a few different things we can do here. Firstly, h4 is incredibly appealing. Bishop d3 is also good. I'll go bishop d3. One of the interesting sort of ideas in this opening is to bring the bishop to d3, push h4, and once h5 happens, right, stopping the advance and attacking my queen, we drop our queen back to g3, and then you can have potential sacrifices on g6 by sacking the bishop, especially if the bishop comes to d7 and blocks the king's retreat to the queen side. That can be very, very difficult for black to defend. Also, this will often occur in conjunction with a knight coming via f3 to g5. Okay, f6. f6. You might be tempted to take. Personally, I don't think it's a great move to take, because we allow the knight into the game. e5 will happen with tempo, and black will storm us. So, to me, there's three options. we have to respond to this, because the threat is take, take, take with a fork. We can't allow that. So one, we could defend with knight to f3 and develop another piece. But then after takes, we don't want to take with the knight in trade, so we take back with the pawn. And it's definitely a line. It's definitely a line. We could also consider f4. So if takes, we can take with the f pawn, which is another potential. The only issue with f4 that I see is it blocks our bishop's access to the h6 square. So maybe we're just encouraging the move knight h6 into f5, where the knight is actually quite strong. Another move is bishop takes g6, as I alluded to earlier. And after h takes and queen takes with check, if the king comes over to f8, I mean, we have no immediate knockout. If the king goes to d7, we can try and trap the rook, but knight h6 and everything looks secure. So, I'm leaning more towards the move knight to f3. And you might be a bit cautious of playing this move. Maybe cautious isn't the right word, but normally I don't like this move because after this trade, I'm like, oh no, my pawn chain is ruined and my c3 pawn serves no purpose. And it is a little bit annoying, and I will run through this line after the game with the engine, but I don't think it actually matters because black's position is so cramped. We still have excellent control over d4, so d4 can't be played. And our e5 pawn is still keeping the e6 pawn in place, blocking this bishop's development and allowing us to play around it. So we'll check that out after the game. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. So f5 played, which my opponent might as well have played that in one go, because I would just play queen g3. I was not going to take en passant. So this is basically a free tempo. I think queen to g3 is the move that makes the most sense. Also notice this knight just literally can't develop anywhere. That's the main reason I went knight f3 instead of f4, because like I said, f4 I believe allows knight h6 into f5, and then black can kind of try to untangle his position. But here, this knight just simply can't develop, right? As I said, this g6 move weakened the dark squares, and as we can see, my opponent's paying the price for it, having to go bishop f8 just to get his knight into the game. And we have a few choices. We could push h4, which personally I find very tempting, because h5, I don't know how black defends. I mean, h4, I suppose knight g to e7, h5, if take, you can take with a knight. Even then, it's incredibly uncomfortable. We could go knight to a3, which is an interesting move. Intending after knight g to e7, knight to b5, getting into d6 because the bishop is blocked off from the defense. Which looks very nice because this knight can only go back to g8 to open up the bishop's defense. So after knight a3, the critical line would be take, take, knight g to e7. But then, I mean, we have the bishop pair. Our bishop is on an excellent diagonal. Pretty nice. Pretty nice. So, okay. Knight a3 or h4. I suppose one argument would be if h4 knight g to e7... Whoops. If h4 knight g to e7, we can maybe merge the two ideas. And instead of playing h5, then go knight to a3. Threatening knight b5. And there's no pawn to a6. Because as we saw in the last video on my channel in this opening, in a different position, but similar ideas, right? Knight b5 can still be played, because if takes, whoops, you hang the rook. So, h4 is going to be the move I choose. I think this has to be the best move, from what I can tell. Again, we'll check it all over with the engine afterwards, but basically what I'm saying is, okay, that's not a move I even considered. I also don't think it's a move I should be particularly concerned about. I mean, taking makes no sense in my eyes, because this bishop sucks. So knight g5 is a candidate move. Basically just blocking up the diagonal. And if take, pawn takes, we open up the h-file. Oh, no. We'll probably take with the bishop and then play pawn h5. And by playing this, I'm also preparing knight a3, knight b5, knight d6. Right? We also potentially have knight h7, queen g6 ideas in the future. There is rook f7, but like maybe the knight hangs at the end of the line. So I love the look of this move. Knight g5. Often when you're attacking as well, you don't want to trade too many pieces, because the more pieces on the board, the more complications, the more attacking opportunities that can occur, right? So you might be saying, well, how is this avoiding a trade? Because your opponent offered you a trade of dark square bishops, and you can be like, right, I understand taking is bad because we help the knight develop and probably get into g4, or go back to f7 to monitor the dark squares. Makes a ton of sense. But doesn't knight g5 facilitate a trade anyway? Would it not have been better to go bishop to a3 and avoid the trade entirely? Maybe. But I want the a3 square for my knight, because I think this idea is incredibly powerful. But I also don't want to trade the bishop. So I can move my... I mean, to me, this knight has now served its purpose, right? The purpose was to protect e5 after the move f6. Now, that's not necessary, because the pawn has advanced to f5. This pawn chain is completely secure. It can't be attacked from any angle apart from the pawn coming to b4 somehow, but you can't access b5 anyway. So queen e7. Honestly, I don't know what that move does. Maybe my opponent's trying to castle queenside. That's my best bet, because otherwise you're just taking up the last developing square for the knight. We could even push h5, but I don't see a need to do so. If knight a3, bishop d7, knight b5, queenside castle, knight d6 check, that still looks crushing. That still looks crushing. I mean, king moves, and I refuse to believe that's not winning. I mean, a knight coming into f7 should probably end the game, because the rook is trapped. So let's go knight a3. As I said, the move pawn a6 does not help, because knight b5, take, we take the rook. One of the big ideas of the Mengarini Sicilian is like, you give up a pawn, sure, but it's like a c pawn for the a and b pawns, right? And obviously the c pawn helps to support the center. And you could argue, well, this is a dangerous passed pawn, but like, there's so many pieces on the board, it's not really that big a deal, and it doesn't have enough support anyway. We've got a rook directly lined up with it, and it's kind of more of a liability than anything in many of these lines, because if no a pawn existed, this wouldn't be a problem for black, because we would be trading rooks on the a file. But again, yeah, pawn a6 doesn't work, because we play knight to b5 anyway. This happened in the last game. The exact same thing. In a different situation, mind. But this exact same plan of knight a3, knight b5 into d6 and c7. Same thing. And by the way, don't forget, we're not only threatening knight to d6 check, coming into f7 and just being generally annoying, but also this is another idea, right? And this is why I love the pawn on the e5 square, because it means that our plan of getting the knight to b5 via a3 not only threatens c7 ideas, but also d6 ideas. And I've used this in so many of my games in not necessarily this exact same move order, but this opening in general, because there's loads of ways that black can play against it, but many of the ideas still apply. And I mean, king d7 can't be a good move, right? As in, it might be the best move, I don't know, but it's certainly not the move of somebody with a better position, is it? So, okay. Knight d6 threatens knight to f7, picking up the rook, which, I've got to be honest, I don't see a reason not to play. I mean, sure, technically our knight doesn't have to move. I suppose we could throw in bishop a3 first, right? Hitting the queen. Sure, that makes sense. Although, I mean, does that not just help black? Because then he can develop his knight? I would argue it's not actually beneficial for us to throw in bishop a3. I suppose you do have knight f6, technically, because if take, then you can take. But if knight f6, bishop a3, then this is hanging, and we have ideas of like taking the bishop with discovered attacks. So no, knight f6 can't work. There'll be too many things in the black position under attack. And I always have bishop a3 in the back pocket if I want it, to align the knight and the queen, right? Again, we'll check with the engine to see whether it prefers this first. Although there is actually an argument to be made for bishop a3, and then black can take the knight, because the file is now closed. So bishop a3, ab5, bishop e7, rook a8 check, king e2, rook h1. I've got to be honest, that looks winning for black. That looks winning for black. So, still not over. Still not over. There's still tricks in this position. And, okay, I like the move knight d6. I mean, the knight just can't be removed, essentially. Queen f8, okay. We could start with bishop a3, knight e7. No, I'd rather just come to f7 immediately, I think. If this, then maybe this is the idea. Removing the defender, which does make a lot of sense. So maybe bishop a3 is better. Bishop a3, knight g to e7. My opponent is being very stubborn, by the way. Very, very stubborn. There, I think we have knight takes e6, though, hitting the queen and revealing... Oh, no, what am I on about? My bishop no longer hits this bishop. Maybe we should just castle. And then if knight g to e7, we can play this. I think I like that. I think I like that. Let's just get castled. Be nice and simple. I mean, none of these pieces can do anything. Okay, my opponent takes, which is probably the logical move. But we may be a pawn down still. But, like, I refuse to believe that black can hold on for much longer in this position and maintain any kind of equality. Because let's say a move like knight g to e7, right, trying to develop the knight. Well, we could throw in bishop f6, forcing the move rook to g8. And then, I don't know, rook g8. I assume c4 will be the main pawn break sort of idea, but we could even just play a move like rook f2, b1, threatening this. Which, the more I look at it, the more I really like. We can just switch our attention to the queen side. And like I said earlier in the game, these open lines are incredibly useful for white. And I also said that rook on a8 is a liability because, for example, we're simply threatening to take the pawn on b7, reroute the knight to c5 if we want, and we're going to restore the material equality, probably win a6 as well. And the natural move would be pawn to b5, but we can just take that, because if you take, you lose the rook. So rook to b8. Okay. We can't go ahead and take on a6, because after takes, the knight defends the rook. So it's not too... It's not completely simple. I really like the look of the move rook to b6. A very sophisticated move, essentially stopping my opponent from playing b5 and preparing to double up, which looks very appealing. Do we have anything else? I mean, c4, we're not really threatening anything, and we also just hang the d4 pawn. And I mean, yeah, sure, the rook isn't defended anymore, so we can take here, but I don't want to lose the d4 pawn. It's a very, very nice pawn. So, in that case, rook b6 looks very nice. Because there's no good way for black to remove the rook. The knight can't attack the rook because the knight can't access c8 because the bishop's in the way. And even if it could, I could just take it anyway. Queen d8 obviously pins the e7 knight, and we can just go rook a to b1, threatening all kinds of things on the b7 square. My opponent goes rook g8, preemptively getting out of this, but the threat is stronger than the execution, really. This is one of those cases where we could do this and force this, but, like, we should only do it if we're forced to do it. For example, if my opponent in this position played pawn to h6, then I would play bishop f6, making him move, and then I can continue with rook a to b1. Here, my opponent gets rid of this threat, but it's just a tempo gaining move to get out of the way, essentially, so my attack can come quicker on the queen side. We have pressure all over the board right now. Pressure in the center, pressure on the king side, pressure on the queen side. And also, you will notice that with this pawn structure, our bishop monitors so many squares. And for the time being, the bishop looks like it's completely out of the game because, I mean, literally every single one of black's pawns is on a light square, restricting my bishop no longer. But it's still a very, very good bishop. And okay, my opponent goes pawn to h6. Of course, we could move the bishop. We could even take this knight. Let's see. If we take... We could just go win b7, to be fair. Which looks pretty tempting. We could keep the bishop on the board. g5. I suppose we just go h5 and keep things locked up. If bishop f6... King c7, defending b7. Does that actually work? Does that actually work? Somehow I'm not seeing a way through. So maybe we should take so that we can do this quickly. Maybe we should. Yeah, I'm thinking that it's maybe not the best option. The computer might say just go bishop f6 and keep the tension, or it might say something like bishop d2 and just maintain the bishop pair. Maybe, I don't know, but to me this seems like the most simple way of going about this position because we just win this. Yeah, also queen takes doesn't look very good. Also, the a6 pawn will likely fall. We have knight to c5 check if we want it. We've restored material equality now. So 23 moves into the game. We sacrificed a pawn on like move 3. So we win it back 20 moves later. But we have a completely winning position. Although that is a really interesting move. Okay, well, let's think now. So the idea is if I move my knight, then take, 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 and I just lose a rook, right? So let's not do that. I have a couple options, though. I have a couple options. I was first considering this, and then, like, knight a5 check, but the king just goes back to c7 and guards the rook, and we have nothing. So, okay, what about bishop takes a6, just adding another defender to the knight? That I don't see a problem with. If rook to a8, we can go knight to c5, guarding the bishop and getting out the way. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's do that. We also have queen to d3, transferring the queen to the queen side and helping out with the attack. And then maybe we have sacrifices and like the queen coming to b5 or something along those lines. That could materialize. For the time being, we still can't move the knight because the rook would still hang. But it's interesting. I mean, queen a3 could technically be played, just applying pressure, which my opponent does. So nice call from me. But I'm not too concerned about that. It's not a very concerning move. I don't think it does anything particularly. We could just bring our queen in and do something like that, which looks pretty nice. Again, sacrifices just don't work. They just don't hold any substance. Yeah, I can't play this, getting out of the way with tempo because the bishop hangs. So I like the look of this. Queen d3. I think the queen should be transferring to the queen side regardless because she served her purpose on g3, right? Helping to weaken the king. And now, alongside all the other pieces, she's swung over to the center and into the queen side. We are now up a pawn as well. Knight a5. Okay, interesting. Very interesting. Hitting the knight, of course. So if I play knight takes, then still just rook takes. So I think queen to b5 makes a lot more sense. Just adding a fourth defender to our knight. If queen takes here, well, then we can just take the knight and be up a piece. And if rook takes, then queen takes. So if queen here, bishop d7. Bishop d7. We could play queen c5 check. And then queen c5, pawn c5, making sure the rook is well defended, is an option. Because if knight c5, then again, we lose the rook. Yeah, that seems like the best option to me. It seems like the best option. Of course, I mean, I don't care if this happens, because I'll just do this. Bishop d7 is the most interesting move. Do we have anything else other than queen to c5 check? Okay, that is not something I thought he would play. I mean, the first move is queen c6 that I'm considering. And I don't see a reason not to play it. It just removes another defender of the knight and forces the king backwards. Yeah, I don't know. It seems pretty self-explanatory. And then I suppose we take. We can take with a rook, but no, there's no need to sack a rook there. We don't have this check because the knight controls that square. Also, the queen controls that square. Let's just do this. Let's be nice and simple. I mean, we should have a winning attack, but we are also just up a pawn. And this pawn will probably fall as well. And then the rook is weak, g6 is weak, f5 is weak, h6 is weak, d5 is weak. We just break the very base of the entire black pawn structure, essentially. And then it should all topple anyway. And when you have like a queen on the 6th rank like this and a king on the 8th rank, you get lots of positions where like you can just shuffle along, checking and winning all the pawns kind of thing. So that could happen. Okay, that's a good move. That's a good move. Okay. So I suppose he's basically trying to force me to trade queens with him. Which, I mean, isn't such a bad thing. Isn't such a bad thing. If queen here, rook here, king c7... Yeah, that's a little bit annoying. If like this, bishop c8... Yeah, we're having the same issues we had before there. I could come to c5, but that really ruins the pawn structure. Although, actually, I mean, c6 is going to happen, isn't it? So queen c5, pawn c5. King c7, pawn c6, bishop c8. Rook back to b4. Looks strong. We could do this as well, though. Take. But I feel like this pawn doesn't actually pose a threat, whereas this pawn does. That's just my opinion, though. I could consider the very tricky rook to a6. Because if take, then I can... Oh, no, because then... No, I just lose the bishop. Let's go queen c5. So black forces a queen trade, essentially. But he will give me a passed c-pawn. And it will be a double pawn. And it will ruin my central pawn structure. But my argument is that it doesn't matter if it ruins my pawn structure in the center. Because my pawn is going to come to c6. And keep my bishop occupying your B file and your A file because you can't access A8 and C8 you can't access with a rook. And then, I mean, I can try and break up the E pawn maybe. Although, I suppose if I close off the 6th rank, then I can't. King C7 is the move I'm looking at because it just applies a ton of pressure. And pawn C6 seems like the response. If bishop takes, not bishop takes hanging the rook, but if c6 bishop takes, rook takes, hitting the king, and then we should be good. So let's do this. This looks all fine. If bishop to c8, then I suppose we just drop the rook back. If bishop takes, pawn takes... Am I losing that pawn? Maybe, but then I can also bring the rook back to b6, because then the 6th rank would open up. And even if I do lose the pawn, I would be winning these pawns in return, most likely. Might also be an idea to go f4, but I suppose g5, I can't really stop it, because it's got a lot of support, at least for the time being. I think my opponent's done a good job of making this a difficult conversion. Also, rook a6 can be considered. The first idea being to come to a7 and align with the king. And if here bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes, king takes, I take on e6. And that should be a winning endgame. So I actually prefer this. Because, yeah, if you take this bishop, then everything opens up for the rook. And if you don't take the bishop, then rook a7 comes. And most likely your king will have to retreat. Or, let's say, I don't know, g5 happens. No, he takes. Yeah, this should be fine. This should be very winning. I didn't take with the rook here because I thought the king could move, but I just realized c6 is defended. Arguably, black can hold the tension. Although, I mean, e6 is hanging anyway, so a move like rook e8, I mean, black is completely frozen. Really? After rook to b6. Yeah, black is frozen. So, okay, yeah, takes should be easier, though. So we'll take the rook. We'll take on e6. And we're only up a pawn, but my argument is that we have a passed e-pawn, and black's pawns are way too vulnerable. Our rook is very active, and our king is inactive. If our king was on d4, for example, I'd say this is completely game over. Yeah, this looks... I don't think that was the best response. I think the best idea was trying to create counterplay by winning the c-pawn. Yeah, coming to c8, trying to win the c-pawn and push the d-pawn. This seems to make my life a little bit easy after rook d6. You lose access to c3. You can't defend d5. I mean, if you go rook to d8, what would we do there? I wouldn't take... I know we're up a pawn, but like maybe it's a little bit complicated. I would just take on g6. And there's just no counterplay. I mean, if rook e8, e6, king d6, take, rook takes, and king takes, there we're up 2 pawns, which is more than enough to win. Black has no passes. Okay. Pawn to g5. We could also take the d-pawn, and then the black pawn structure there. Black pawn structure would be in tatters. So we'll do it this way. If king to c6, we have rook to d6 check, picking up that pawn. I like the move e6 in this position. I'm not really playing e6 to try and create a queen. I'm also either using it as a decoy to distract my opponent's rook to maybe allow me to collect the last of the pawns, or to allow me to take on f5. So if like here, I mean, black just can't defend. You just can't defend everything. And then, yeah, we create a double attack. And we'll get a position where if black takes on c3, we'll take on h6. And you have to be careful in rook end games not to have positions where you're 1 pawn up, because they can often be draws. But here, because it's 2 pawns versus nothing, I'm very confident that this is completely winning. There's many ways to win this. I think I like rook f6, though. And the reason being is that I want to cut the king off from accessing the f-file. So what I'm going to do is drop the rook back to cover the 3rd rank. And I want to go g4, king g3, basically. So the rook keeps this king cut off. and then I can bring my king up with my pawn, and I can always advance my rook with the pawns and my king, right? Kind of keeping this king as out of the game as possible. Of course, I will accept a rook trade. That's a no-brainer. Let's bring the king up. I mean, this is the most elementary win ever. 2 pawns versus a king. Unless sometimes when they're doubled, it can be drawish, but here, I mean, no chance. No chance. We just consistently force the king back. Here we'll take some space. And yeah, the black king, this is not stalemate because he has the h4 square. And then I will just push the pawn, and black can't keep up with the pawn, and we will promote to a queen and then deliver checkmate. So, expecting a resignation. There we go. Good game to my opponent. A very interesting game. I feel like we could have executed that attack a little bit better. I think black did an excellent job of defending. So let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. By the way, if you enjoyed this game, share it with someone you think would like it. That would be really cool of you. Okay, so I've just looked over it. I have seen where I went quote-unquote wrong. I mean, the endgame with the 2 rooks and bishop versus 2 rooks and bishop was like +2 anyway. But we were much more winning if I found a certain line. So I'll show you that when we get there. But okay, so c5, a3. As I said, we kind of treat knight c6 and e6 in the same manner because both of them add another defender to b4. So as we saw in the game, we had this with the bishop, we kicked it back, and the computer does like bishop to f8 in many of these lines because g7 is so weak. But if the knight were to come to c6 instead, then the exact same thing happens, right? We get the exact same type of position. Compare this to this. Whoops, to this, right? It's the same kind of thing. So, d5, not the best move. And the only way for white to fight for an advantage here is the move pawn to e5. Because let's say you go like bishop d3. I mean, d takes, bishop takes. It's already -1 after like knight f6, bishop f3. We just have no play. We need to restrict this knight and this bishop with the move e5. So we play that. We go. My opponent goes knight c6, which is very typical. But to be honest, this knight can't really do a whole lot. Queen g4 is the best move, going after g7. Sorry, yeah, g7. And king f8 is a move a lot of the time. Bishop f8 is also a move. But g6 is the best move. The computer's having a hard time actually evaluating this. Some of it says equal, some of it says +0.2. But I would say in a practical sense, this is better for white. So bishop d3, just a good developing move. And as I said, in some lines, h5 gets played. And let's say a move like bishop d7. In some of the lines, I mean, not immediately, but in some of the lines, you can do this and have a pretty good attack. Not here, of course, but in some of them you can. f6, though. And here, I was debating between pawn f4 and knight f3. I ended up going with knight f3, which is the best move. But I'll show you why I rejected pawn f4, which, by the way, is a bit of a mistake. So I was initially concerned about knight h6, which is a good move. And after a move like queen h3, the knight comes back to f7, as I described. But also, my opponent can push f5 here. And now it's a bit different, because obviously my opponent did that in the game. But in the game, our bishop was still open. Here, though, the bishop is completely shut off. And the best we can probably do is trade it off for this bishop, which I'd rather not, to be honest. So knight f3. If fe5, of course, we're not taking with the knight, right? We're going to take with the pawn. Because the pawn, of course, controls these 2 squares. And this knight has more potential than this knight, in the sense that this knight could jump into g5 at some point. The only purpose this knight has is defending e5. So f5 from my opponent. We drop the queen back. Just keeping pressure. Just general pressure, right? Keeping an eye on the dark squares. Bishop f8, which I mean is a very sad move. And we go h4, which is the best move. Black has to be a bit careful here. So I was expecting knight g to e7, where I was intending to play knight a3, which is completely winning. After h6, which is the best move, knight b5, rook g8. This is the best engine line. And then, I mean, just knight d6 should be pretty winning, right? This is similar to the game, to be honest, which was not good for black. So bishop f8, it's move 11, and black has 1 piece developed. h4, bishop h6. And here, yeah, so taking is not good. I mean, we're still winning, kind of, but, like, we can do better than that. Knight g5 is a good move, as well as bishop g5, which I did consider, but actually the engine changes its mind. It prefers knight g5 after it's looked at it a second time. The idea is, if bishop takes, then bishop takes, and after knight g to e7, I mean, h5 is on the way, knight a3, knight b5, knight d6 is on the way. Because all the black pawns are on light squares, the dark square bishop trading itself off the knight is a travesty. So queen e7, we go knight a3, and you just can't stop this. The computer's favorite move is bishop back to f8. So we've gone bishop b4, bishop e7, bishop f8, bishop f6, sorry, bishop h6, and bishop back to f8, all in 14 moves. That's like, how many moves is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in 14 moves. But my opponent goes a6, which just doesn't stop the threat. King d7. And I almost went for this. But as I said, this is actually losing. ab5. Here, 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 here. And I can save the bishop. But black is up a good bit of material. And the game is a little bit... is not as bad as it should be, just because of how terrible the black pieces are. But, like, why would we do this? So knight d6. Computer quite liked castling as well. But knight d6, queen f8. And here I just castled. I did see these c4 ideas, which the computer quite likes, but I didn't see why I would be sacrificing a pawn here. I mean, the variation is queen e3, knight c6, cd5, ed5, and then we sack the knight and do this, which, I mean, now we see it makes sense, but it's unnecessary calculation. So castle, bishop g5. I was concerned on this, sorry, on knight f7, there's bishop g5, and then I have to bring this knight back, because if I take like this, then this happens. But the computer actually wants this, which I've got to be honest, I have no idea why I rejected. I mean, this just wins the exchange. So I probably should have done that for the sake of simplicity. But okay, I castle, bishop takes, computer prefers queen takes, and if queen e7, then we drop back. And I suppose that takes away the developing square for the knight, okay. So bishop g5, knight g to e7, rook f to b1, d4 was also a move, rook b8, and here, yeah, rook b6 is a good move. Second best move after pawn to c4. Which, again, I just didn't see why I was going into these complications, because taking makes no sense. Yeah, it just seems very complicated for no reason. I suppose the point is we're opening up the d file? Maybe? So when this knight moves and this knight either gets captured or moves, then there's only one more layer, but rook b6 is still the best move, though. And we stop the move b5, basically. So rook g8, rook a to b1, h6. Yes, taking on e7 is the best move. Awesome. So I rejected bishop f6 on the basis of g5, which is the best move. And after something like this, I mean, we're winning, but I don't know. I quite liked this instead. So I take on b7. Computer prefers c4 again. If takes, then we do this, and then knight b7. And I wish I could... Oh, I think the difference is that this can happen. Oh, so there's no king c7 because of e6. That's very cool. Okay, and if this happens, then we take and then push in the future, I assume. And if takes, well, then this doesn't open. And then we just transfer the queen over. Okay, whatever. Whatever. Knight b7, king c7. And we take on a6, which is very good. Queen a3 is the best response. Queen d3 is very good. The computer actually likes this. And then queen d3. Which, I mean... Okay, I can see that now we have this. And this. And then this, and we're mating. But very complicated, really. Queen b5. Oh, sorry, I've gone forward a couple moves. Queen d3, knight a5. Queen b5, adding a ton of protection for the knight. And after knight b7, queen c6, bishop b7 is apparently preferred. And now if bishop d7, we have bishop c6, which makes sense. Yeah. But I go for this, king d8. The computer wants rook takes, which I mentioned in the game. But after bishop takes, I couldn't see the point. The point is queen b6. If king c8, then we have a mate forming, because the rook has to sack itself. And if king d7, we come back. Oh, we force the king to the back rank and then win the rook. Okay. But I do this, and my opponent finds the very nice bishop to d7. And the... Wait, what am I... Where am I here? There was a move that I missed that I should have played. Ah, yes, in this position, I shouldn't have taken the knight. The computer wanted rook 6 to b3, hitting the queen first. And if the queen sticks around, then we take. And if bishop b7, we basically gain access to the d6 square by kicking the queen away. And if the queen retreats to e7, then we take. And the point is there's no bishop to d7 because now we can access the a file. So basically, what happened in the game is after bishop to d7, we could neither access the a file because the rook was in the way, and we couldn't access this diagonal because the queen was there. The engine wants to get the rook out the way, kick the queen away, so we either have access to d6 or a6 once bishop d7 happens. But we find the best move, queen c5. The other move was queen d6. This one I didn't like as much because I thought this pawn wasn't actually very scary because it's blockaded. So I chose queen c5, which looks counterintuitive to ruin the structure like this, but it's actually the best idea. King c7, we push c6, bishop c8, and I just go rook a6, which I thought was a cool move. And here, black can't really do anything. The best move is this. I would not trade. g4, rook to b4, and if rook to g5, now we take. And if something like rook takes, c takes, and this, the two passed pawns are killer. So bishop b7 was played. cb7 is actually the better move. Okay. Why is this worse? Rook b7, cb7. Oh, okay, so black ignores this and just defends. Ah, and after this, rook a6, we have to come up with another plan. And if f4 and then takes, the computer still thinks we're winning. But to be honest, it's probably a draw. Probably a draw. So cb7 is the best move. The best idea is to defend the pawn, which I thought he would play. But I have rook b to b6. And I can sack the pawn and take this. And if king moves, I can just do this. If the king moves, I can take. If the king moves, I can take. So, and also if the king... Well, there's no other move, actually. So rook b7, king b7. We take on e6. And yeah, so I thought the best option for black was rook to c8. And going for something like this, I don't know, just trying to win the c-pawn and push the d-pawn, which, I mean, the engine says is completely losing, obviously, but this is a bit of a scarier thing for black to try. I mean, if I waste a move, for example, okay, that would be checkmate, but let's say I waste a move, then I'm losing after pawn d2, rook c1, and d1. So something like this, check, here, and here. So this was what I thought was the best try. King c7, though, was easy. I just go rook d6, g5, I take. I don't care about losing the pawn because I'm just sweeping up all the other pawns, and then rook and 2 versus rook is completely winning because the pawns are together. And also, I have the move rook f6, which is the best move, cutting the king off. Even if the king can get involved, it's still completely winning, but this is just easier, right? Let's say the rook just tries to be a nuisance. I mean, I can just move my rook up. The king can't do anything. And I can slowly just advance up the board. Like, I can slowly advance and keep pushing the pawns. I mean, this is actually a little bit unnecessary, but you get the point. The rook and the king will come up with the pawns, and this king can't quite get over there. But my opponent offers me a rook trade, which of course makes the game incredibly easy, and resigns here because he can't stop the pawn. I hope you guys enjoyed this game. I will be linking at the end of the video, so it should be appearing probably up here now, the game that I played in yesterday's video at the time of recording, where instead of e6, we had knight to c6 and had a very similar sort of game. Well, not a similar game, but a lot of similar themes. So if you want to check that out, again, it will be appearing up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down there. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in one of those videos.